Okay, so we are here today with our weekly skill session, weekly skill building session for National Survivor Network members. And this week we're going to be talking about professional boundaries. This is a big topic. It's super hard for all of us to navigate. And I'm going to be honest, if you're working at an organization or doing this work, this is probably hard for some of the non-survivors you work with to navigate as well. Boundaries in a workplace are just kind of hard to navigate sometimes. We're going to come back to this when we do our check-in after, but we're going to start by just figuring out what do we mean by professional boundaries. And again, today we're just going to barely touch the surface of what all there is out there. This is the kind of thing that we could have like a year-long course on professional boundaries and still not cover everything we want and need to cover. So being conscious that today we're just kind of planting some seeds, and this is stuff we can all follow up with in our own time after and continue the conversation. But one of the things I'd love to introduce you to is this amazing author and counselor, Nedra Tawwab, who in her really wonderful book, I believe it's called Set Boundaries, Find Peace. She defines boundaries as a boundary is something that keeps us safe and comfortable in our relationships, that is communicated through both our words and our actions, right? Boundaries can be communicated through words, they can be communicated through actions, and some of the stronger boundaries will have both of those together. Great book, incredible Instagram page. If you want to follow her on Instagram, she's amazing. And I've learned so much about boundaries through her Insta. I see someone in the chat is saying her Insta is awesome. Love it. Love it, love it, love it. So this is just kind of like a broad definition of boundaries, but I like that it says it's something that keeps us comfortable in our relationships, right? And it reminds me, there's a lot of different kinds of relationships. And I know typically when we're thinking about boundaries in relationships, we start by thinking about things like parent-child, intimate partners, romantic partners, friends and family. But I kind of want to just highlight the idea that anytime we interact with another human at all for any length of time, that's a relationship, right? For the amount of time that it lasts. And that includes with our coworkers and colleagues, our supervisors and bosses. We might have boundaries with people in our community, maybe even strangers for that moment that we're waiting at the bus stop, whether we choose to interact with each other, to chat with each other, we're still navigating shared space together. And so in that moment, that's a relationship. And that means that while a lot of the information out there on boundaries and relationships may be written to be about parent-child and intimate partners and friends and family, that doesn't mean we can't take some of these concepts and think about how they apply in the workplace. So work is work and social is social, right? We do tend to talk about work-life balance, where we're remembering that those are two separate categories in our lives for the most parts. But still, effective movement work, where we're engaging to end trafficking or to transform social justice norms, effective movement work is still heavily built on relationships, right? When we're thinking about things like the sustainability of our work, whether or not we can keep going in this work. If we don't have relationships, I think we all learned during the pandemic, even those of us who worked in relationship or in offices or in organizations or in physical locations, when a lot of us ended up not having those in-person and relational connections as part of our work, we realized how important those relationships are to making the work feel sustainable. Right. So even at work, we're going to want to have relationships with people that feel good, even if they're professional relationships. Healthy workplace relationships require time and attention, just like all your other relationships, meaning that just like in your friend or family relationship, if there's a conflict that comes up and your way of handling conflict is to completely pretend like it's not happening, that may not be conducive to fostering a healthy relationship. It's the same in work. Some of the same dynamics that happen in families where we don't name the thing that everybody's watching happen can impact workplaces in the same way, where we're watching a dynamic that doesn't seem healthy and we're not addressing it. So we want to remember that even though these are professional relationships, we still want to give them time and attention. And they also, just like our other relationships, our workplace relationships require grace and repair. So grace meaning, this was a word that I know it comes from religious traditions, but it was a word that got used a lot in my prior workplace in a way that was meant to be like, hey, we're all going to make mistakes, and we need to give each other the space to know that we can make mistakes and still be valuable, still be respected, still be collaborators, still be seen as good at our job, right? We need to be able to give each other the opportunity and space to make mistakes and still be in relationship. And when there's ruptures to those relationships, workplace relationships still need opportunities for repair. Like sometimes having that opportunity to come back and hear each other about the workplace challenges that we're experiencing interpersonally. Coming back and hearing each other can be really helpful, and then figure out what would it take to make repair. And again, just like all our other relationships, our workplace relationships are healthier when they're supported by boundaries. All of us have at different points had the experience of being in relationships of some kind with people who did not have boundaries, did not ever articulate boundaries, were afraid to set boundaries, crossed our boundaries, mocked our boundaries, disrespected our boundaries, or ignored them. And it's not a good feeling, right? It's not a good feeling. It doesn't feel safe. It's not conducive to clear thinking. And that comes into workplaces that do not have space for people to have their boundaries. There's a few complicating factors as we're thinking about all of this. The first thing that makes this harder is that some workplaces don't foster healthy boundaries. To be honest, there's some workplaces where if you have a boundary or articulate a boundary, you're punished. And that might be a formal punishment. We don't allow this boundary to be a part of our workplace, or it could be informal. Okay, so you set a boundary that we don't like. We can't formally punish you, but we're going to exclude you from opportunities or deny your opportunities for advancement because you have boundaries that make it hard for us to exploit you in our work. It also complicates things. Another structural factor that complicates things is neither capitalism nor poverty foster healthy boundaries. We have this hyper focus on productivity over wellness, and that benefits from eroded boundaries, meaning that those who are doing hiring and managing know that they believe they can get more out of their people if their people and workers don't have boundaries. And similarly, if you're living in poverty under the current model of capitalism, and you know that the only way you can have that job is to not respect your own boundaries and not ask others to, and that's the only way you can make the income, you don't often have a lot of choices, right? So we recognize our current structures don't allow for healthy boundaries. We also know that power dynamics are real. Meaning, if someone is your boss, someone's your supervisor, there is a power dynamic there with that supervisor. That supervisor has some power over your work, over how your workplace feels. Hopefully they are getting training on trauma-informed and culturally responsive supervision. But we know that's not always the case. And just because there's a power dynamic doesn't mean you don't get to have agency over your life. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have some degree of control over your life, but those power dynamics can often make us afraid of consequences when we have boundaries. We also know that boundaries are hard to navigate in professional spaces when we don't have a lot of models for this in our lives. If I don't see in my workplace, in my work history, in the people that I know, if I don't see people talking about how they navigate workplace boundaries, it's hard for me to know what looks healthy. That's the same when you grow up in a toxic home sometimes. You don't know what healthy relationships and boundaries look like, and you're kind of feeling it out for yourself. And it's the same with workplace boundaries. There's also some personal factors that complicate this. And this isn't just for trafficking survivors. This is for anyone who's dealt with hard things or other kinds of trauma in their past too. This is a broad issues. The first one is that sometimes we've developed unhealthy ways of navigating boundaries to survive situations where our boundaries are continually violated. And then we end up bringing some of those unhealthy ways of navigating boundaries into our workplace. I have that with my attachment trauma from my own history. That manifests in work. If my supervisor is out of town for a few weeks and we don't get to touch base as often, by the time we get to our next supervision meeting, I'm pretty convinced I'm about to get fired and that they hate me, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I haven't seen you to get the reassurance. Is this real? Like, I notice that coming up in me, and I have to manage that and figure out how to take care of myself. The other thing personally is sometimes having the ability to say no or to set needed workplace boundaries. It's a place of privilege. So for example, if I have 4 different jobs trying to hire me to pay me well, then I can say no. I can turn down contract income that doesn't support my values and align with what I want in my life. But a lot of times that's a privilege to be able to say no. And so sometimes we are going to be taking work that's not our ideal work because we're trying to make the best choices that we can. But we can also acknowledge that in an ideal world, being able to say no would not be a privilege, and we can keep working towards that world. And then the last thing is, as trauma survivors, sometimes we have to train people in our workplaces on how to treat us and what our boundaries are while we are currently still relearning how to navigate those boundaries ourselves. This can happen in workplaces where there may be well-intentioned, they may not mean any harm, but they may have assumptions about who trafficking survivors are and what survivors are capable of and how survivors should be treated and what it's okay to ask survivors and what it's okay to tell survivors to do and how you tell them what to do. They may have some assumptions because being a good service provider to trafficking survivors doesn't automatically translate into being a good colleague to trafficking survivors. And so part of what we end up doing in these workplaces often is helping retrain them on how to show up with us as survivors and colleagues while we're still trying to learn how to navigate boundaries. And that might mean that sometimes we're going to make missteps, right? This is where that grace and allowing ourselves space to be human and to make mistakes gets really important. There's another quote I love from Prentice Hemphill that says, "Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously." Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And this is sort of a reminder your needs matter and your care matters. That these we know they're not prioritized structurally and in the way our systems are set up, and they still matter and they should matter. Like in the ideal world, we would not have to do work that did not allow us to receive care and have our needs met. And I'm going to offer a reframe on that quote by Prentice Hemphill. Employee well-being matters at least as much as the work that we're doing. And so if I reframed that quote, I might say, boundaries are the emotional, mental, physical, and temporal space that allows me to do my job well enough while maintaining my wellness without abuse or neglect of myself or others. So the emotional space, some days you're going to have harder days than others, and we need to have a little bit of room for that to happen without it being considered like not doing our job well. Mental space. This is where we think about that sensation when you have so many projects going on that you can't give any of them your full focus, right? So we want to have the mental space to do our work well enough. Physical space, there may be physical needs that are important to our ability to do our work well. And that could be anything from accessibility all the way down to like having time breaks to eat and meet your basic physical needs. And temporal space, we really just mean time management. So if someone's inviting you to meetings all day long, all week long, and then expecting you to still get other independent work done, you don't have enough temporal space to do your job well enough. And notice again, it doesn't say to do my job perfectly. It says to do my job well enough, right? Because well enough is what we're going for, while maintaining my wellness without abusing or neglecting myself or others. And what that last piece reminds us is that as we're caring for our wellness, we're also in relationship with other people who are also caring for their wellness. So we're trying to find the solutions and the strategies and the boundaries that help us all feel well enough and safe enough in this environment. So boundaries may be different based on whether or not your job is crisis work or not crisis work. You still need boundaries, but it might look different. So for this discussion, this is not like a global discussion of what a definition of what crisis intervention is. This is just giving us a framework. Non-crisis work is work that is not fundamentally focused on responding to emergencies or states of crisis. Non-crisis work might include things like being a trainer, a panelist, a program manager, a teacher, a mentor, communications director, strategist. These are all non-crisis work. And I would say these are movement jobs I was thinking of, but even in, non-movement jobs. So in jobs like retail, that is not crisis work. All of these kinds of positions may occasionally have fires to put out, so to speak. But if they're being structured well and boundaries are being respected, they should not constantly feel like crisis management. If you have a non-crisis job and it's constantly feeling like crisis management, there's probably something going on with one of those kinds of boundaries, and some better boundaries can help that. Boundaries can help non-crisis jobs keep from starting to feel rushed and chaotic. When we have boundaries and we incorporate them into our program planning, as we think about things like capacity and staffing and how many people do we need and how many hours to get this done, that can help non-crisis work from feeling like a crisis. Crisis work is when your actual job description is to respond to other people's, organizations, or communities' actual emergencies or intense internal crises. And I added that second part because something like, like I've done crisis response on sexual violence hotlines, and someone may be currently in a moment of safety, but having a trauma trigger or a really hard time that's triggered this intense internal crisis, even though they're not actively in an unsafe situation, right? So those kinds of things are crisis work. Work that is broadly crisis work includes things like hotline response, firefighting, emergency management. And there are some jobs that aren't exactly crisis work, but there may be. It's like expected that there's a meaningful percentage of your job that's devoted to crisis intervention, even if your job's not fundamentally crisis. That might include something like a case manager, shelter worker, or a counselor. Boundaries are still important to crisis intervention. And so we'll talk a little bit about how those look. But even in crisis intervention positions, you can still have boundaries. You can still ask for your boundaries to be met. So professional boundaries, you can only do so much. If you've ever been someone who said yes to too many things and then had that moment where your head is spinning and you're like, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? I'm reminded a little bit of like Mary Poppins' bag, where she like opens a small bag and is pulling out house plants and floor lamps and all kinds of stuff. because it all fits in there somehow. That is not how our calendars work. That's not how our capacity works. You're a human. And, while we can have like really interesting theoretical conversations about like time and space, for the purposes of our work, time is finite. You have so many hours in a week. And you can't just keep adding more things to your plate without adding more time, at least not without having impacts on both your wellness and your job performance. And being expected to do work without getting paid is exploitative. So if you're getting paid for certain amounts of work, doing a lot of work that you're being expected to do without getting paid is more exploitation. Whether it's happening in a movement organization or not, it's still exploitative. Remember, a culture of overwork is ableist, breeds resentment and burnout, is not trauma-informed, and works against our equity priorities. Some organizations, and I would say some movements, normalize this culture of overwork, and it makes it hard for people who don't want to or aren't able to buy into this and perform according to this culture of overwork. It makes it hard for them to be sustainable in the work, for them to stay in this work and find jobs. This norm of overwork, it can have different roots. So sometimes organizations have institutionalized this as their norm, and that makes it hard to say no or protect your own boundaries because they explicitly expect overwork. Sometimes organizations may have some employees who regularly choose to overwork, but maybe they don't expect it of all their employees. So it may be like a cultural norm in the workplace, even if it's not explicit. And then sometimes you'll have organizations that will normalize healthy work capacity by regularly reminding their employees or their contractors, hey, how's your workload feeling? Are you able to keep up with this? I have a new project I was considering, but I know that it can always be backburnered if you need a little more spaciousness in your schedule right now. Those are the things that you can actively do to push back against that overwork. So this first one, with an institutionalized overwork culture that's expected automatically of all people, your boundaries, you're going to have a hard time navigating boundaries in that space. We don't have capacity to get into all of that in this training. And also the ones that are normalizing healthy work capacity are already doing a lot of the things they need to do. So we're going to highlight kind of talking about this one. What do you do if you're in an organization where nobody's telling you have to overwork? And maybe they're even telling you don't have to, but you're seeing some other people do it and you feel a need to keep up. Or some other people who are overworking may be tapping you in on projects or asking you to join them. So one strategy you can do is enlist someone's support in prioritizing the tasks on your plate. So you can say something like, here's one option. I was looking at the tasks for this project, and I don't think we've estimated enough work hours to complete them. Would you rather that I reduce the number of tasks I'm expected or to extend the deadline for completion? That's one way to set a boundary. Another one might be to say, I'm not sure I can fit that in this week with the 3 other tasks you'd wanted me to do. Is there one of the other tasks you'd like me to put off until next week so I can get this one done? It's helpful to remember that there's always going to be more work to do. So being like, oh, well, once I get caught up, I'll have healthy boundaries again, can be a trap. Sometimes you have to be the one that gets someone to help you prioritize. So another strategy is saying no to offers or projects that don't align. And by align, I mean with your values, your goals, your intent, your capacity. I was really proud of myself when I finally started to learn how to say no to things I didn't want to do. Because that was hard for me as a trauma survivor. I would find myself agreeing to do workplace projects and tasks and contracts that I didn't even want to do. And I finally got to where I could say no to those. And I was like, victory, I have arrived. And then all of a sudden I started to get opportunities to do so many things I wanted to do that I couldn't say yes to them all and still do them well and be well in myself, like have wellness. And so I had to start learning how to say no to things I did want to do because I recognized I just didn't have capacity. And there may be different ways you prioritize that. It may be based on where you think you can have the most impact. It may be based on financial needs, but being able to say no to things you don't want to do is a wonderful first step. And being able to say no to the things you want to do but can't, so that someone else can maybe do it better because they have more capacity, is a really, really big thing. Your emotional wellness does matter. So in addition to your capacity and your time management, your wellness matters. Again, you deserve care, safety, and respect. And when we get burnout at work, we're going to be less able to be gentle with ourselves and to be gentle with our loved ones and our families. You hear some people say all the time, if something happened and you died next week, your workplace would be working to hire a new person. They might grieve you, but they'd hire someone else. Your family won't. So remember, and family, remember, I'm including your chosen family in this, right? Your loved ones, the people who you have that are your people. We can't even be gentle and show up with them if we're burnt out. And the other thing is, when we're so consistently burnt out or overworked, our ability to heal our own trauma gets impeded, because sometimes that trauma processing requires slowing the pace, having time to ourselves, having time to do our work, right? Our internal work. And if we're overworked and burnt out, whether you're a trafficking survivor or not, we can't heal our own stuff, right? So that overwork, that burnout in places where our boundaries aren't being respected, or where we're afraid to set our boundaries, that can make it hard for us to stay on path with our healing from our trauma. So some strategies for managing that. One of them might be what I call the 3-beat pause. And what I mean is, if you're having a conversation with someone and they ask you a question and it feels like it's a crisis, right? They're like, oh, I need your help with this thing right now. Can you do it? You can ask for the pause instead of being like, yes, because your sense of urgency suddenly became my sense of urgency. Instead of doing that, you can say, you know what, I'm going to need a moment to sit with what my capacity looks like, and give me just a moment, right? With an email or text, it might mean that you delay a response if something's not really a crisis, just because that person's freaked out. If it's not an actual emergency, sleep on it. Just because they say respond by 5 o'clock today doesn't mean that if it's not part of your job description, that doesn't mean you have to get on their sense of urgency with them. So sometimes wait until you respond, slow that roll until you've slept on it, or until you've had time to sit with it. You may want to check in with yourself. This is another strategy. Our bodies, even when we've learned to do a lot of dissociation, our bodies still try to give us helpful information sometimes. So be conscious of how does your body feel when you're dysregulated? What happens when you're dysregulated? And then maybe think, while I'm at work in my professional field, when do I notice that dysregulation really kicking up? That dissociation really kicking up? What are the tasks? What are the projects? What are the collaborators or coworkers? Pay attention to those patterns and learn from them, and that'll help you figure out what boundaries you might need to protect your emotional wellness at work. This is also the thing with protecting your space a little bit. One of my former supervisors used to always remind me, unless it's literally your job description, someone else's poor planning is not your emergency. This is also the reminder to be a good coworker and give yourself plenty of time to plan things so that you're not the one dragging people into the emergency with you. But someone else's poor planning is not your emergency. So let's say you get the rushed demand for a speaker next week, or I need something and I need it quickly, and you know that it's not enough spaciousness for how you want to do your work and do it well, or you don't have capacity. You can write back, and we can still be compassionate. We don't have to write back and say, your poor planning is not my emergency. You can write back and say, oh, I'm so sorry, things are feeling rushed right now. Unfortunately, I don't have capacity to help you wrap this up, but I hope you're able to find a solution. That's a compassionate response. It acknowledges the feeling of rushed. It acknowledges your capacity. And then it gives them, a message that you're connected. Like, I hope you're able to find a solution, but it still protects your space. I don't know if you've ever been in the situation of taking on other people's emergencies and crises in a workplace that weren't really your job. And then you find yourself going, I never have time to do my own job anymore. Right? Sometimes these sort of responses can help keep you from landing in that situation. We want to remember too that not all relationships look the same. I have a word, I don't know if someone else invented this, but I've referred to them as froligs, which is my friendly colleagues. They're colleagues that I work with. Maybe I don't have the same kind of friendship with them that I do with my everyday friends, but we're friendly, right? You can choose whether or not you want to spend time with colleagues outside of work. Some people love being friends with coworkers. Some people don't. You can choose. So if you're in a space where people are all friends with each other and everybody's super close, you can remind yourself, I don't have to be part of this if that doesn't feel good to me. So choose whether or not you want to spend time with your colleagues outside of work. Maybe you find that sustaining, maybe you find it exhausting. You want to remember that it, as much as we're able in a pandemic, hard enough to make friends as adults. It's nice sometimes to have friends outside of work so you don't feel like you're always working. Because without fail, a lot of times you get around those coworkers to hang out for fun and you end up talking about work. And that can then lead you to feeling like you aren't getting the rest from your work or the spaciousness to reset. And just because we may have professional boundaries with our colleagues where we may choose not to socialize, we may choose to maintain stronger boundaries, that doesn't mean we don't care for them. We can still treat them as whole people. I can have a colleague or a coworker that I care deeply about and that I see at work who's having a hard day. There may still be gentleness with that person because I acknowledge they're having a hard time, even if I don't, end up volunteering to be their therapist for the day, right? You can still have a boundary while being compassionate. There can be challenges to thinking of our colleagues as family. I know that there's a lot of writing online about how when a family says, welcome to the family, or where we're not just a job, we're a family, that it can be well-intended, but a lot of times it can be a red flag that workplace doesn't allow boundaries or that there's unhealthy dynamics. This can be tricky for trafficking survivors because a lot of times it's normal for survivors to be like my survivor sibling or my survivor sister. And sometimes that can then complicate as you move into survivor leadership and movement leadership. How do I relate to this person as colleagues now? Because that can then bring some of those family dynamics into a workplace, and not all family dynamics, especially between trauma survivors, turn out to be super healthy or beneficial to good working environment. So think through how you want to navigate that, because that family dynamic, especially for those of us with attachment trauma, abandonment trauma, that can can add an extra element of urgency or fear when we have a workplace conflict that can then make it harder for us to navigate what would otherwise be less charged workplace conflicts because the stakes are so much higher for us. The fear of losing our family, these people who become our family. You don't have to have any level of boundaries or closeness with coworkers at all. You can choose where you fall on that spectrum, but be thoughtful about it. Just know you don't have to go along with what other people are doing just because you see them doing it. Think about what works for you. So crisis work still needs boundaries. You need boundaries when you're navigating boundaries and power dynamics with clients. I've seen this happen a lot to where people who are working with clients may have poor boundaries. They may ask questions that aren't really relevant to the mentoring, the support, the therapy that they're offering. You still need to navigate boundaries with your management and your coworkers, and you still want to protect your non-work time, right? If you're not on call, say you're in a job where you're on call and you have a phone and you have to be available while you're on call, When you're off call, turn your work phone off if you have a separate one. Be transparent with yourself and your leadership team about unrealistic workloads. So if you're in a space where you have an unrealistic workload and nobody's acknowledging it, you can be the one to name the unrealistic workload and how that's impacting both you, but also your work, right? We don't do as much as good work when we're overwhelmed. And if you are in leadership at an organization or on a project, you may want to recommend against taking on new programs while your staff are at capacity. So if you're hearing from your current staff that they're overwhelmed and you have an exciting opportunity to get funding for a new program or project, you may want to think about how you can manage that capacity first before bringing in new work. So in practice, winding around the corner with the last piece, in practice, boundaries protect your space. An example here of not having the best boundaries is replying to other people's non-crisis urgent emails whilst being bitter and resentful because you can't get your own work done. Replying to other people's non-crisis urgent emails with a super long and somewhat defensive explanation of why you can't fit it in right now. If you wanted to have boundaries that are a little less charged dynamics, one approach might be to wait to respond till you have more space and less of a sense of false urgency. That might look like, hi, I'm just now getting around to this as I had to prioritize my primary contracts this week, but I'm happy to set up a time with you to chat more. Here's my scheduler. Right? So you just didn't respond until you had capacity because it's not your job. It's not essential. It's not coming from your supervisor or your boss. You're waiting till you have capacity. A lot of times, another example of boundaries protecting your space is sometimes we begrudgingly rearrange our schedule to accommodate someone else's urgent non-crisis that's not part of your job description. Like, sure, I can do this now. Might as well just get it over with. And then you realize later you can't get all your work done. And a way to work around that might be to offer a time to meet that works with your existing schedule and priorities. This might look like replying and saying, hi, I'm so sorry I can't be helpful any sooner, but I'm all booked up through October. If you need a meeting before then, you might need to connect with someone else. But if mid-October works, let me know and I'll send over some possible meeting times. Right? And you see how in this, you're sort of taking charge of protecting your own space, but in a way that is collaborative. Another thing that we sometimes resent is answering work calls during off hours or vacation to let people know it's not a good time. If you answer that phone, you are inviting yourself to a conversation. Maybe if you answer the phone to be like, oh, why are you calling me on my off hours? You answered. The other thing is answering work calls during off hours or vacation and taking the work call and then grumbling later about like, I've told them over and over, I don't take work calls in the evening. So maybe some workarounds are don't answer your phone if your coworkers aren't honoring your schedule or hour. You can tell them, I'm gonna not answer my phone when I'm off. Maybe you follow up with them the next week and say, hi, I had this weekend off and was unable to take your call. Did you want to set a time up this week to follow up? Again, you're taking charge of protecting your space, but you're still being collaborative. So boundaries are not the same as control, right? So you aren't telling them what they have to do. You're telling them what you're going to do. So for example, control would be, I have a boundary that you can't call me after work hours if you're a colleague. Versus just saying, I have a boundary that I don't answer work calls after hours. That's kind of like, if you want to try calling me, that's your thing. You can leave me a voicemail, but I don't answer work calls after hours. Again, you could try saying, I have a boundary that all grant reporting data must be sent through the proper form. Or you can just tell people, I have a boundary that only the data sent through the form will be included in your department's report. So if you want to make sure your stuff gets included, you'll need to use the form. Right? Do you kind of see the difference on those? You're telling them what you're going to do. And then just final reminders, boundaries aren't mean. A lot of us who are trauma survivors and have been abused or exploited by others have been convinced or told or treated as if when we set a boundary, we're the ones being mean. That's not true. Boundaries aren't mean. Boundaries are a way of saying, I still want to be in this work. I still want to be in relationship with you, but here's what I need to make that happen. Our boundaries are ever evolving. So something being your boundary now doesn't mean it always will be. And then also, as we learn and grow, our understanding of how to navigate our boundaries is also ever evolving. And so recognize that there may be things you're just now learning and figuring out about boundaries, and there can be a tendency to want to criticize ourselves for not realizing that before or understanding it before. But all of us are always on this journey of learning more and more about how to navigate that. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you so much for joining us.